Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight, my guest is linguist Douglas Whalen of the Haskins Laboratory at Yale University. He's president of the Endangered Language Fund. Dr. Whalen will tell us about the Endangered Language Fund, or ELF for short, which awards grants for language preservation. Welcome, Doug. Nice to have you here.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on what is probably the longest running show about language in the history of television.
Hey, let's hear it for Wordpath. I'm so glad that you could take the time to let our audience know more about ELF, because it is one of the places that people can apply to get funds for their language programs or aspects of their language preservation work. Maybe we could start with some of the basics. What is the Endangered Language Fund exactly? What is its mission and so forth?
The Endangered Language Fund is a nonprofit institution that I established in 1995 in order to work on endangered languages from both the community's standpoint and from the standpoint of linguistic science. And our ideal candidate projects are ones that inform both linguistic science and help preserve the language. Language preservation, of course, takes all sorts of forms, and in many cases, continuing to have the language spoken is not the ultimate goal, but preserving the language in a variety of modern media is often quite useful in itself. So we support projects that do all sorts of different aspects of that job of trying to keep language alive.
Can I ask you a little bit more about these two sides of it? Because I think this two-pronged approach is very unique to ELF. In other words, there are various linguistic research projects that don't really have as part of their goal at all preservation of the language, and then there are some funds available for language preservation that really don't care about the world of linguistic science. So what are some of the kinds of benefits that might accrue to linguistic science from some of these projects? Can you give us just a couple of examples?
Well, certainly many of the languages that are endangered right now have been very sparsely described, and some of them have never been described. There's just a lot of language diversity out there that we still haven't explored. No language has ever been figured out completely. We've had dozens, if not thousands, of linguists hammering away at English for 100 years or so of modern linguistics, and we still make amazing discoveries every day. So compare that to a language that has never really even had a dictionary created for it, and you can see that there's a lot of material out there that just hasn't even been tapped yet.
So just having something recorded in some form, whether it's written or audio or video taped, is a kind of that serves linguistics in ways that we can't even predict sometimes, right? Because at least we'll have a sample of what the language is really like.
That's certainly true, and especially since many theoretical linguistic papers are written on the basis of very sparse data themselves that is often taken from secondary sources. Being able to go back to primary data to check that is something that hasn't really been possible in many cases until quite recently, with modern technology making things available that were simply inaccessible before.
Right. And of course, on the other side, the community language preservation goals are served, I'm sure, in as many ways as there are types of oral literature, songs, stories, all sorts of things that people might want to preserve for their own community's purpose, in order having something for their grandchildren to be able to witness.
That's absolutely true, and not only that, simply having a focus on the language itself is often something that hasn't been done in decades or perhaps never, that people have let their language slip without quite realizing it. That many times parents will be speaking the language at the home, and they don't quite realize that their children don't use it anymore. And so the decision, if it can be called that, to start abandoning the language is made without any real thought being given to it. Sometimes simply having someone interested in the language from a linguistic standpoint brings awareness of the situation home to people, and several instances that I've heard of, it's resulted in people taking active steps to keep their language going.
So that's actually one benefit of the linguistic interest that might accrue to communities.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about that linguists and communities question later if we have time, but let me back up for just a second because people might have gotten the impression that ELF just serves Indian languages or Oklahoma Indian languages or something. What's the scope of your work?
The scope is worldwide. Every inhabited continent has endangered languages, and they all have uniquenesses about them, or they wouldn't be separate languages, but they also have a lot of commonalities, and our approach is to try to make an effort wherever an effort is feasible. So about half of our projects have been in North America, largely due to the fact that we're in North America. It's not where the largest number of endangered languages is. I mean, that would basically be wherever there's the largest number of languages. It's more common for a language to be endangered than not, and so...
Give us, I've mentioned some rough estimates before, but give us some idea of the scope of the language endangerment problem in general. What's your current estimate of number of languages that there are and number that are endangered around the world?
Well, there are 6,800 languages listed in the most recent edition of the Ethnologue, which is probably the most accurate measure that we have. As you know, it's very difficult to get this kind of data because it's not well done in surveys, in standard statistical surveys. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of money to get a really good language survey, and the money simply isn't there. So for most languages, we just don't know what's going on with them, except in a very rough way. Certainly, we have dozens or hundreds of languages that are only spoken by people in their 50s and above, and those are going to require extraordinary measures to keep going.
Right.
And we can assume that many of them will not receive those efforts, and so will die out as their speakers die out. But even the ones that are currently being learned by younger children, in many cases the children start out with the indigenous language and then switch to some national language later on when they hit school primarily.
Yeah, of course here in Oklahoma that's switching to English, and in South America it might be switching to Portuguese or Spanish, and in the Soviet Union it might be switching to Russian or whatever.
So it's, you know, English is not really the killer language. There are regionally dominant languages in most countries, and those are the ones that tend to start taking over. There are a few cases in old colonial regions where English was the one that was chosen, but more typically it will be some large indigenous language that will simply absorb all the smaller ones.
And it's going on at a really alarming rate these days, isn't it?
Probably in 100 years there will be at best 3,000 languages left. So it's really an amazingly dramatic shift.
I would think that would just be shocking to anyone who has any interest in language in general. Anybody that's interested in studying a foreign language or something, they have some concept that language diversity is interesting, if nothing else. I mean, it certainly means a lot more than just being interesting to native communities, for instance. But most people find the diversity of languages, even though they may not know how many languages there are, they find this idea of there being different languages sort of interesting. And then to be confronted with that kind of statistic that probably within 100 years, you said, 50% or more, probably more than 50% can be expected to have become extinct.
Right, and I've actually been saying more than 50% lately because the signs are just everywhere. And you can even see signs of endangerment in what's basically a very healthy language like Dutch. There are entire segments of the population that use English more than they use Dutch, even within Holland, although you do still find plenty of monolingual Dutch speakers. But that's the kind of encroachment that starts turning a language into an endangerment situation. Certainly Dutch is not endangered now and looks to be able to survive for several more centuries. They've done it all these years already. But it's amazing that you can see the signs even there.
That is amazing. I hadn't thought about that issue before. So often we tend to stereotype endangered languages as the languages in the so-called primitive cultures, the languages that haven't been written or haven't been, aren't used on television and radio, and they don't have that high-tech or even low-tech connection. They're simply spoken languages in small communities. Of course, you realize that they're likely to become endangered unless they become a regionally dominant language. But a language like Dutch has been written down for centuries, and the high-tech connection is there, and yet still there's this encroachment that goes on. So nobody's safe by definition, just because they've written their language or recorded it or taught it for centuries or anything else. It takes more than that to be one of those surviving languages.
And presumably languages have died throughout history. There again, we don't really know how often it happened, because the further back you go in time, the less of a record we have. Some languages we only know because the Romans managed to mention them in some place or another, but that's about all we know about them. And you can assume that there were just hundreds of languages that never got noticed by anybody in the historical record. So it's extremely difficult to tell how often they died off. What is happening right now is something that we can tell is different, though, in that entire language families are dying off. So languages can spring up certainly over the course of 1,000 years or so, but entire language families are disappearing right now. Like all of the Australian Aboriginal languages are basically moribund at this point. There have been some revitalization efforts where people have started speaking them again based on historical records, and those may succeed to a certain extent, but for the most part the Australian languages will be disappearing, and that's an entire extremely unusual branch of language that will disappear. So even if those 40 or so languages are replaced with 40 new languages, the 40 new languages are going to be far more related to each other than the Australian languages are to any of the languages that are going to replace them. So it's very much like the kind of diversity that you see in rainforests, where if you wipe out a certain proportion of those, you've really wiped out entire different branches of species, as opposed to just different exemplars of a large genera.
So, and of course, one of the implications for linguistic science in that is that part of the overall research agenda of linguistics is to find out, get a better understanding of what human language is and what the possible variation in human language is, what's universal in human language, and so forth. And if people start making pronouncements without having considered a whole branch of what human language is or has been, then their statements are sort of unintentionally biased in a way. So I think sometimes people in native communities who, maybe we will get into this just a little bit now if you don't mind, some of this, as you're aware, there's sometimes suspicion of the academic world, or linguistics or any other branch of academia in native communities, partly because of unfortunate history or perceived history that they feel some researchers have come in, taken parts of their language, gone off with it, and they got no benefit from it. And they're often suspicious of people from the outside who say, well, we're doing this for linguistic science, or we're doing this for anthropological knowledge or something, and they think, well, why should we care? And of course, some people don't care about the overall agenda of academia and could care less about the knowledge of how human language works. But there are people, moral people, I think, very moral and upstanding people in the world who care about that, who are trying to get a better understanding of that, just as psychologists try to understand behavior and emotion and so forth. Linguists try to understand language, and clearly if they only look at a certain skewed sampling of languages and try to make pronouncements about what human language is, then their statements will not be as accurate and reliable and revealing, insightful as they might be.
There are entire segments of speech. I work mostly in sound myself in my own research. The click languages of South Africa are the only languages that we know of that consistently make use of these click sounds.
Can you just demonstrate one or two for us?
Like in Osa. And they sound extremmy strange. If you ever saw the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, the pops that come out of the Hottentot are just amazing. But if we had never discovered those languages and they had died out, we would be absolutely convinced that those sounds could not be part of speech. And we would have extremely good reasons for saying that, and they would be very convincing reasons.
It would sound very reasonable.
And up until you find some language that actually makes use of them. And when you start getting into the levels of grammar and the way that words can combine and so forth, it gets far more complicated, especially when you consider that we really haven't come up with a convincing way of describing even the well-known languages. Even the well-known languages are quite resistant to the kind of analysis that we've been giving them. And I don't think that any linguist feels that we have quite plumbed their depths yet. And certainly the way that many other languages seem to work gives you pause for thinking that we've actually got this nailed down. This came home to me a bit when I was finally convinced of why it was so hard to write down Navajo. And one of the reasons that it's very difficult to write down is that every sentence is grounded in the speaking situation, so that the grammatical forms actually reflect where the speaker and the listener are in relationship to each other in physical space, and perhaps even to the orientation of the directions, and things that really just cannot be taken out of context, because writing is basically taking the speech out of context, putting it onto a page, which then becomes the context, but the page is not a context that Navajo evolved to deal with.
Wow.
And so it makes it really difficult to write.
So I don't want to go on and on too much about this academics versus community, but I do think that your organization is very unique in wanting to serve both interests, and I think in a very ethical and appropriate way. But of course, the end products, you give out grants to worthy projects, you select some each year, right? And part of the end result is that then you make available the tape or whatever result of the fruits of the work, make available to, of course, to the community and to the linguistic academic community as well. So I think people that might be considering applying for these grants just need to know that it's not for sort of secret knowledge kind of things. That's not the kind of thing that this funding would be appropriate for, because there is an agreement that the material will be disseminated, right? But what kinds of, give us some of the basic outlines of how the grant system works, who's eligible, when are the deadlines, what kind of money are we talking about?
First let me just say that what I have heard is the native definition of a linguist. A linguist is someone who comes to your community for 2 weeks and starts telling you things about your own language.
Yeah, right. That certainly fits with a lot of what I've heard, yes.
And
as a linguist myself, I kind of chuckle, and then I kind of have to think, well, we need to listen to that too.
If the experience was bad, that's where the definition stops. But if the experience was good, the definition continues, and he was right.
Very good, yeah.
And I think that that's definitely true, that there are some linguists who have come and studied and not realized that the community wanted to receive anything in return, and didn't have anything that they were capable of returning. I think part of it is that the kind of linguistic analysis that was possible until quite recently simply did not generate the kind of output that would be useful to a community. Nowadays, when you can do recording of on videotape as well as audio tape of things that have genuine meaning to a community, it's much easier to return to the community than it used to be. I mean, even 20 years ago, when it was possible to record, it was still very expensive. I mean, just the actual tapes were expensive, and the recording equipment was expensive and not very widely distributed. Now we tend to forget just how much things have changed technologically in very recent times. I mean, now every computer comes with a CD burner, so that you can quickly turn out extremely durable and high quality products to return to a community. And so we're hoping to do more of that. Good. The other thing that I think is very helpful, and especially for more and more communities in this country, is getting material on the internet. Because more and more, I mean, it seems kind of useless to a community that's out in the Amazon rainforest and has no internet connection. But you would be kind of surprised at some of the communities that do have internet access, even out. I mean, one person pointed out that some of the refugee camps in West Africa actually have occasional internet links when they have no possibility for cassette players or anything else, and so actually putting things on the web makes it more accessible than doing more low-tech things. So it's a very quirky world.
It really is. the effects of technology are sometimes very contradictory
Right.
and unpredictable too.
Right. So anyway, getting back to your question about who's eligible.
Yeah, I want to make sure we get that in.
It's open to anyone who has a language project that they want to perform. Basically, about half of our projects have gone to community-based people and about half to academic linguists. And that's been a real source of pride to us because we've had to actively work to get that balance. Because it's actually just a lot easier for an academic to crank out a grant proposal than it is for a community person. And so we've actually bent over backwards to make sure that the community projects get submitted and get considered seriously. Maybe a fourth of our principal investigators have actually been native speakers of the languages involved.
Right.
And so there's been a lot of good effort on that regard. So it doesn't require a linguistics degree, doesn't hurt either, and it's open to people working with an endangered anywhere in the world. Now, if it's someone outside the community, we do require that they show that they have the community relations in place to make the project feasible. So that it's not possible to simply get funded because you think it might be a good idea to go someplace. You have to do a little bit of groundwork first.
And what size of grants do you get?
So far the grants have been rather small. They've been growing every year. So we've given away more money every year since we started. But they're on the order of $2,000 to $3,000.
Okay. I think I'm going to need a little drink too. $2,000 to $3,000 per project, and it's a once-a-year deadline, right?
Right.
And the deadline's just about upon us for this year, isn't it?
Yeah, this year's is April 22nd.
Okay, so it's generally in April,
so
sometime
April
in
20th is our usual deadline.
Yeah, okay. All right, so people would probably be thinking about something for next year.
Yeah.
And we'll give information at the end on how they can get in touch with the fund through the Department of Linguistics at Yale,
Right.
and a web address as well and telephone number. Let me see now what we haven't covered. Can you, I might just briefly mention that we were really pleased that the Wordpath Society was able to use some funding from ELF to do, as far as we know, the first all Choctaw language programming for television, which we then used as part of a Wordpath show some months ago, a couple years ago now, I guess. A show called The Baby Has No Name. We had a good time doing that, and the funding was just crucial to that. It really made it possible where it wouldn't have been.
It's one of our favorite projects as well because it was really an innovative use of the funds. I mean, most of our funds still are going to fairly traditional work in dictionaries and grammars and texts. And this was the kind of creative thinking that we were hoping that we would be able to generate, so that simply seeing the kind of work going on in that language, I think, makes a big difference to the people speaking that language. Somehow seeing things on TV validates them in a way.
Yeah, that was one of the aspects of that I like, that people just aren't used to seeing their language on TV. They're used to seeing English or maybe Spanish or other languages, but not their own native languages, and there's absolutely no reason why it couldn't be done. It just takes some doing. So we were really glad to be able to do that. What are some of the other kind of projects you've had besides the dictionaries and more traditional things? Can you think of any others that were especially interesting?
Well, we had one that was seemed kind of strange because the actual expenditure was just for gas money, but it was to support a wider range of guests on a Dakota radio program. And many of the Dakota elders were out in fairly remote areas and would never come into the studios. But the Mary Defender Wilson, who was the person doing the radio show, was able to go out to their homes and record the program out there. And simply by having enough money for the gas to do this, she was able to really broaden the range of her show.
Yeah. So I think you've done a good job of making a little bit of money go a long way. That's one of the good skills in being in your position.
Yeah.
They must be hard choosing among proposed projects, though.
It has been, and it's gotten harder every year, but I see that as a really good sign because there's a lot out there and people are interested and they're ready to do the work, and it's clear that there would be more that we could do if we had, if we had more money. And we are working on that, but as you know, that's a job in itself.
And I guess if people would care to contribute to the fund, they could contact you at the same contact points that we'll give at the end of the program.
Absolutely.
You'd welcome any contributions,
Yep.
right? All right, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I wanted to give you a chance to tell a little bit about your own personal history. You have some Oklahoma connections, and you are a linguist. I don't know how you first got interested in the endangered language question, but maybe you could just give us a little personal background.
Yeah, I went to high school in Oklahoma City, and so, you know, it was, I think, a fairly typical urban experience in Oklahoma that I really did not know many Native Americans, and probably some of the ones that I did know never told me that they were Native, and certainly never heard any of the languages spoken around Oklahoma City. So it wasn't until I moved away that it really became an issue for me. I didn't turn to linguistics until college. And I'm a phonetician by training, and I do most of my work on the sound system, and I mostly work on standard languages, mostly English. It became clear to me that I was just not going to be getting out into the field to do any work on endangered languages, and yet it seemed like one of the most important things to be done nowadays in linguistics. There will be linguistics as long as there are any human languages. You know, even if we get down to one, there will still be linguistics. But the linguistic material that's vanishing before our eyes is truly astounding and irreplaceable. And to think that I would do nothing simply because I was not a real field worker was very unsettling, and I thought about what I could do, and one thing that I seem to be able to do is to ask strangers for money. So
Well, that's a good talent to have.
so I started doing it, and it's worked out fairly well. I've been pleased with what we've been able to do with the limited amount of money available to us.
Excellent. What have we not covered yet? Let's see. You said you didn't anticipate getting out in the field and working on endangered languages. Are you doing any kind of research along those lines lately? Or?
The thing that I have been starting to dabble with is doing a bit of archival preservation. Ives Goddard has some tapes of Delaware that we've started digitizing, and these are tapes that are a semi-permanent record of the language, but they are actually sort of rotting in place. The material of the tape is degenerating, and the equipment that can play them at that slow speed, they're actually recorded at 1 7/8 inches per second, which none of our machines can actually do, even at Haskins Labs. So it needs to be perpetuated in a way, and this archival issue is actually a very large one. I believe that there's a massive amount of archival information out there that is going to disappear and basically force these languages to die a second time.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I do know we've done a couple of shows actually on the issue of archiving and how to do it and things not to do it. Well, sometimes people get a false sense of security because they feel like, oh, we already have that on tape, that's okay, and they forget that tapes need to be cared for in a certain way. No tape, no medium yet known to humanity will last forever as far as we know. Collections need to be, monitored and managed and migrated and copied and all this sort of stuff. And just knowing who has what tape is a good starting place in a lot of communities, I know. And you can't just tape something once and leave it alone and figure your job is done.
But we're hoping that putting things on the internet is going to make this extremely more useful, because even having a tape still generally limits it to an audience of one. Usually it's the person that made the tape that gets to listen to it.
Right.
And even though he could play it for a large audience, it almost never happens. So putting it on the web, I think, is going to make the language material available in a way that's going to revolutionize the field of linguistics. I think that having immediate access to large amounts of primary data is going to make a huge difference in the way we think about language.
And hopefully it'll be really make quite a difference in Native communities as well.
And I think so.
Well, I want to thank you for your efforts at serving both of these kinds of interests related to language, and for projects of the Wordpath Society that you've funded and all the other projects that you're going to be funding. I know you've benefited a number of projects in the state of Oklahoma already, and I'm sure will continue to do so. So thank you very much for coming and spending some time with us.
Thanks a lot for having me, Alice.
Right. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hele yo hele, na hele yo hele, ana magwara kita, wa pele malaole kita. Na hele yo hele, na hele yo hele, ana magwara kita, wa pele malaole kita.